Hello, this is Mike Corelli with the Introduction to International Relations class online. Welcome. In today's lecture, we rely on Chapter 7 in our textbook, Essentials of International Relations, the 8th edition, by Karen Minkst. In Chapter 7, titled International Cooperation and International Law, our esteemed author addresses elements of international relations that include realism, vis-a-vis the cooperation problem, neoliberal institutionalism and cooperation, and constructivism and cooperation. Naturally, our book looks at international law and cooperation through both international relations theory and its perspectives as outlined in Chapter 3, and our lecture of that name, namely Realism, Liberalism, and Constructivist Interpretations, as well as by levels of analysis that we also examined in Chapter 4. Many of the key terms found on page 267 are covered in this recorded lecture, namely economic interdependence, horizontal enforcement, international cooperation and international law, legitimacy, transaction costs, treaties, tariffs, and universal jurisdiction. My fervent hope and expectation is that you, the student, will have read Chapter 7 and perhaps taken the quiz in the Canvas platform, which will prepare you to listen to this lecture with definitions and understanding of the topics being covered already under your belt. That being said, using our textbook as a preparatory, indeed as a springboard, we'll launch in today's lecture where we examine international law and cooperation in a much deeper, cohesive manner, drawing on our ideological levels of analysis, again as covered in Chapter 4, including individual, group, system, and global considerations, while also drawing from our lecture in Chapter 2, you may remember the historical context of IR, but also, if I may, as a foreshadow of our next lecture next week that's going to be based on Chapter 8, where we discuss soft power and the international political economy. In other words, we are going to draw on all our work heretofore as we begin to study the Washington Consensus and its institutions, starting with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and then heading into the World Trade Organization. So, my friends, this segment is just a little bit different from our previous lectures because instead of only having one seminar question to choose from, herein you have 3. I would ask you to pick which one of the 3 seminar questions you want to respond to in your 2.5 to 3 page double-spaced essay, due naturally on the date established in the Canvas platform. I make this option available because I feel that folks often have a specific interest in perhaps banking, in trade, or in development. And so I hope to capture your inherent interest and thereby enthusiasm by allowing in this one and only chapter that choice. All right, so let's dive into our examination then, shall we? Our first possible choice of seminar questions asks you to discuss whether SDRs, or another global currency created by the IMP, a cryptocurrency, should perhaps replace the US dollar as the international reserve currency. Your second option is to describe the main criticisms of the IMF and the World Bank and describe what opportunities they may have in the future. By the end of this section, you'll be able to understand the history and the purpose of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to describe the IMF's current role and major challenges and opportunities, to understand the history and the purpose of the World Bank, and to describe the World Bank's current role and its major challenges and opportunities. In looking at our studies today, Asking the question, what is the international monetary system? We'll be discussing how, during the 1930s, the Great Depression resulted in failing economies. The fall of the gold standard led countries to raise trade barriers, devalue their currencies to compete against one another for export markets, and curtail usage of foreign exchange by their citizens. All these factors led to declining world trade, high unemployment, and plummeting living standards in many countries. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement established a new international monetary system. The creation of this International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank were two of its most enduring legacies. The World Bank and the IMF, often called the Bretton Woods institutions, are twin intergovernmental pillars supporting the structure of the world's economic and financial order. Both have taken on expanding roles, and there have been renewed calls for additional expansion of their responsibilities, particularly in the continuing absence of a single global monetary agreement. The two institutions may seem to have confusing or even overlapping functions. However, while some similarities exist, they are two distinct organizations with very different roles. The similarities between the IMF and the World Bank: they are both owned and directed by the governments of the member nations. Almost every country on earth is a member of both institutions. Both concern themselves with economic issues. Both focus on broadening and strengthening the economies of their member nations. Both hold joint annual meetings. Both are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and they both share joint task forces, sessions, and research efforts. Despite these and other similarities, however, the bank and the IMF remain distinct. The fundamental difference is this: the bank is primarily a development institution. The IMF is a cooperative institution that seeks to maintain an orderly system of payments and receipts between nations. Each has a different purpose, a different structure, receives its funding from different sources, assists different categories of members, and strives to achieve distinct goals through methods particular to itself. The International Monetary Fund will be our first focus of examination, including its history and its purpose. One may ask themselves, what does the IMF do? Well, the architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, envisioned an institution that would oversee the international monetary system, exchange rates, and international payments to enable countries and their citizens to buy goods and services from each other. They expected that this new global entity would ensure exchange rate stability and encourage its member countries to eliminate the exchange restrictions that hindered trade. Officially, the IMF came into existence in December 1945 with 29 original member countries. Remember that the Soviets, who were at Bretton Woods, refused to join the IMF. In 1947, the institution's first formal year of operations, the French became the first nation to borrow from the IMF. Over the next 30 years, more countries joined the IMF, including some African countries in the late 1960s. The Soviet bloc nations remained the exception and were not part of the IMF until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The IMF experienced another large increase in members in the 1990s with the addition of Russia. Russia was also placed on the IMF's executive committee. Today, 187 countries are members of the IMF. 24 of those countries, or groups of countries, are represented on the executive board. The purposes of the International Monetary Fund are sixfold: to promote international monetary cooperation through a permanent institution which provides the machinery for consultation and collaboration on international monetary problems, and to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, and to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment and real income, and to the developments of the productive resources of all members as primary objectives of economic policy. Furthermore, to promote exchange stability, to maintain orderly exchange arrangements among members, and to avoid competitive exchange depreciation. to assist in the establishment of a multilateral system of payments in respect of current transactions between members and in the elimination of foreign exchange restrictions which hamper the growth of world trade, to give confidence to members by making the general resources of the fund temporarily available to them under adequate safeguards, thus providing them with opportunity to correct maladjustments in their balance of payments without resorting to measures destructive of national or international prosperity, and in accordance with the above, to shorten the duration and lessen the degree of disequilibrium in the international balances of payments of members. There are two key terms that we'll be drawing back on, especially when it comes to our seminar question, and these are special drawing rights and the Triffin paradox. A special drawing right is basically an international monetary reserve asset. SDRs, special drawing rights, were created in 1969 by the IMF in response to the Triffin paradox. The Triffin paradox stated that the more US dollars were used as a base reserve currency, the less faith that the countries had in the ability of the US government to convert these dollars to gold. The world was still using the Bretton Woods system, and the initial expectation was that SDRs would replace the US dollar as the global monetary reserve currency, thus solving the Triffin paradox. Bretton Woods collapsed a few years later, but the concept of an SDR solidified. Today, the value of an SDR consists of the value of 4 of the IMF's biggest members' currencies: the US dollar, the British pound, the Japanese yen, and the European Union's euro. But the currencies do not hold equal weight. SDRs are quoted in terms of US dollars. The basket, or group of currencies, is reviewed every 5 years by the IMF Executive Board and is based on the currency's role in international trade and finance. Currently, the weight of the SDR basket is the US dollar at 44%, the euro at 34%, the yen at 11%, and the British pound at 11%. Please remember, the SDR is not a currency, but some refer to it as a form of IMF currency. It does not constitute a claim on the IMF, which only serves to provide a mechanism for buying, selling, and exchanging SDRs. Countries are allocated SDRs, which are included in the member countries' reserves. SDRs can be exchanged between countries along with currencies. The SDR serves as the unit of account of the IMF and some other international organizations, and countries borrow from the IMF in SDRs in times of economic need. Looking at the governance of the IMF, we remember that the IMF is accountable to its member countries. It has a board of governors, one governor from each member country that meets once a year. There are day-to-day affairs that are guided by the executive board, which are made up of 24 executive directors. The managing director of the IMF is the chairman of the executive board. Membership in the IMF is best described in its own constitution, wherein Article 2, Section 2 says, "Membership shall be open to other countries at such times and in accordance with such terms as may be prescribed by the Board of Governors. These terms, including the terms for subscription, shall be based on principles consistent with those applied to other countries that are already members." Membership in the IMF is not conditional on membership in any other organization, such as the UN or the World Bank. Insofar as terms of membership, the policy is that new members should not have permanent rights and obligations that differ from those of the original members. Membership is open to any applicant who is a country within the attributes of statehood defined by international law, is willing and able to perform the obligations of membership contained in the Articles, and accepts the terms of a membership resolution of the Board of Governors. Domestic legislation is not a valid defense for not observing membership obligations in the IMF. Any member may request an interpretation of the Articles of Agreement pursuant to the provisions of Article 29. Members can voluntarily withdraw from the fund. Any member may withdraw from the fund at any time by transmitting a notice in writing to the fund at its principal office. Withdrawal shall become effective on the date such notice is received. Withdrawal can also be compulsory. Procedures are outlined in the Articles, whereby a failure to fulfill obligations may result in ineligibility to use fund resources. It would include the suspension of voting rights and the decision by the Board of Governors by a majority having 85% of the total voting power on withdrawal from membership. Upon withdrawal, statements are made between the fund and the member upon agreement, or as prescribed by the Articles of Agreement. And so, looking at the IMF organization chart in this slide, we see the International Monetary and Finance Committee, the Board of Governors, the Joint IMF World Bank Development Committee, the Executive Board, the Independent Evaluation Office, and the Managing Director and Deputy Managing Directors. So going in then to the Board of Governors, this is the highest policy-making body of the IMF. All powers not conferred directly on the Board of Governors, the Executive Board, or the Managing Director shall be vested in the Board of Governors, according to the Articles. They may delegate to the Executive Board the exercise of any of its powers, except those directly conferred to it. One governor and one alternate governor is appointed by each member. Usually, these are finance ministers or the heads of central banks. There is a weighted voting, whereby they cast the number of votes allotted to the member appointing him. Governors elect one of the governors as chairman. It does not meet in continuous session, rather it meets once a year at annual meetings. And it may establish committees, such as the International Monetary and Finance Committee, or the Joint World Bank IMF Development Committee, to perform functions. The next element of organization, the Executive Board, is responsible for conducting the business of the IMF and for exercising the powers delegated to it by the Board of Governors. It does sit in continuous session, meeting as often as the business of the IMF may require. There are 24 executive directors, with the managing director as the chairman. 5 are appointed by the 5 members of the largest quotas, currently the United States, Japan, Germany, the UK, and France, and 19 are elected by the other members. The elected directors serve 2-year terms. The Board of Governors, again by an 85% majority of the total voting power, may increase or decrease the number of executive directors in the second category, and each director shall appoint an alternate. There is a weighted voting structure, whereby each executive director casts the number of votes allotted to members that he or she represents. Most decisions of the Executive Board require only a simple majority of the votes cast. Some require either 70 or 85% of the total voting power. Remember that voting is rare. Most decisions are actually taken by consensus. The chairman simply ascertains the sense of the meeting in lieu of a formal vote, but any executive director may require a formal vote. The next element in organization, the managing director, the staff, and the independent evaluation office. This is the chairman of the executive board and the chief of the operating staff. They are selected by the executive board. They may not be selected from among the governors or the executive directors, and they serve 5-year terms, but shall cease to hold office when so decided by the executive board. In other words, they can be fired. They conduct the ordinary business of the IMF under the direction of the executive board. They are subject to general control of the executive board, and they are responsible for the organization, appointment, and dismissal of staff. The staff of the IMF are considered international civil servants. Under the managing director, the Independent Evaluation Office, the IEO, conducts objective and independent evaluations on issues relevant to the fund's mandate. Looking at the IMF's resources, the IMF's capital base consists of membership quotas, which is the financial contribution made by member countries. Total quotas amount to about $310 billion. Members' quotas are determined by their economic weight in the global economy, and a member's quota determines its voting power and the size of the loan the country can borrow. Looking then at the financial structure, first we look at the sources of funding. Again, members' quota subscriptions currently at about $305 billion, and then borrowing to supplement the resources available from quotas according to the general agreements to borrow since 1962 and the new arrangements to borrow in 1997, as well as income from investments. So the three sources of funding, again, are the members' quota subscriptions, the ability to borrow supplemental resources through arrangements provided in the articles, and income from investments. So again, members' quotas. Each member of the fund is assigned a quota which broadly determined by its economic position relative to other members. In other words, economic considerations include the member's GDP, the volume of current account transactions, and its official reserves. This determines a member's maximum financial commitment to the IMF, voting power in the IMF, and the size of its access to financial resources, and share in any allocation of special drawing rights or SDRs. Quotas are reviewed every 5 years to determine whether any adjustments are needed in light of the growth of the world economy and changes in individual countries' economic positions. Members must pay subscription equal to their quotas. Up to 25% must be paid in reserve assets specified by the IMF in foreign currencies acceptable to the IMF or in SDRs, and then the balance may be paid in the member's own currency. The voting power for each member has 250 votes referred to as basic votes, plus 1 vote per 100,000 SDRs of quota. Significance of the basic votes have diminished from their original level of 11% of total votes to approximately 2% because of the quota increases. A member's quota cannot be changed without its consent. If a member consents to a reduction of its quota, the fund shall within 60 days pay to the member an amount equal to the reduction. Over time, some members' quotas and representation in the fund got out of line with the member's relative position in the world economy. Thus the need for an annual reform of quota and voice. Looking at the criticism and challenging areas for the IMF supports many developing nations by helping them overcome monetary challenges and to maintain a stable international financial system. Despite this clearly defined purpose, the execution of its work can be very complicated and can have wide repercussions for the recipient nations. As a result, the IMF has both its critics and its supporters. The challenges for organizations like the IMF and the World Bank center not only on some of their operating deficiencies, but also on the global political environment in which they operate. The IMF has been subject to a range of criticisms that are generally focused on the conditions of its loans, its lack of accountability, and its willingness to lend to countries with bad human rights records. These criticisms include the following. The conditions for loans. The IMF makes the loan given to countries conditional on the implementation of certain economic policies, which typically include the following. Reducing government borrowing, i.e. higher taxes and lower spending, higher interest rates to stabilize the economy, allowing failing firms to go bankrupt, and structural adjustment, i.e. privatization, deregulation, reducing corruption, and reducing bureaucracy. The austere policies have worked at times but always extract a political toll, as the impact on average citizens is usually quite harsh. The opening case presents the current IMF impact policies on Greece. Some suggest that the loan conditions are based on what is termed the Washington Consensus, focusing on liberalization of trade, investment, and the financial sector, deregulation and privatization of nationalized industries. Often, the conditionalities are attached without due regard for the borrower country's individual circumstances and the prescriptive recommendations by the World Bank and the IMF failed to resolve the economic problems within the countries. IMF conditionalities may additionally result in the loss of the state's authority to govern its own economy, as national economic policies are predetermined under IMF packages. Looking at exchange rate reforms, when the IMF intervened in Kenya in the 1990s, they made the central bank remove controls over flows of capital. The consensus was that this decision made it easier for corrupt politicians to transfer money out of the economy. This is known as the Goldman scandal. Critics argue that this is another example of how the IMF failed to understand the dynamics of the country that they were dealing with, insisting instead on blanket reforms. For devaluations, in the initial stages, the IMF has been criticized for allowing inflationary devaluations. Free market criticisms of the IMF suggest that believers in free markets argue that it is better to let capital markets operate without attempts at intervention. They argue attempts to influence exchange rates only make the matters worse. It is better to allow currencies to reach their own market level. They also assert that bailing out countries with large debts is morally hazardous. Countries that know there is always a bailout provision will borrow and spend more recklessly. There is a lack of transparency and involvement. The IMF has been roundly criticized for imposing policy with little or no consultation with the affected countries. And tangentially, the IMF is seen as supporting military dictatorships. The IMF has been criticized over the decades for supporting authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Insofar as opportunities and future outlook for the IMF, the 2008 global economic crisis was one of the toughest situations that the IMF has had to contend with since the Great Depression. For most of the first decade of the 21st century, global trade and finance fueled a global expansion that enabled many countries to repay any money that they had borrowed from the IMF and other official creditors. These countries also used surpluses in trade to accumulate foreign exchange reserves. The global economic crisis that began with the 2007 collapse of mortgage lending in the United States and spread around the world in 2008 was preceded by large imbalances in global capital flows. Global capital flows fluctuated between 2 and 6% of the world GDP between 1980 and 1995. But since then, they have risen to 15% of GDP. The most rapid increase has been experienced by advanced economies, but emerging markets and developing countries have also become more financially integrated. The founders of the Bretton Woods system had taken for granted that private capital flows would never again resume the prominent role that they had in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. And the IMF had traditionally lent to members facing current account difficulties. The 2008 global crisis uncovered fragility in the advanced financial markets that soon led to the worst global turndown since the Great Depression. Suddenly, the IMF was inundated with requests for standby arrangements and other forms of financial and policy support. The international community recognized that the IMF's financial resources were as important as ever and were likely to be stretched thin before the crisis was over. With broad support from creditor countries, the IMF's lending capacity tripled to around $750 billion. To use these funds effectively, the IMF overhauled its lending policies. It created a flexible credit line for countries with strong economic fundamentals and a track record of successful policy implementation. Other reforms targeted low-income countries. These factors enabled the IMF to disperse very large sums quickly. The disbursements were based on the needs of borrowing countries and were not as tightly constrained by quotas as in the past. Many observers credit the IMF's quick responses and leadership role in helping avoid a potentially worse global financial crisis. As we discussed in the case with Greece, the IMF has played a role in helping countries avert widespread financial disasters. The IMF's requirements are not always popular, but are usually effective, which has led to its expanding influence. The IMF has sought to correct some of the criticisms. Looking at its flexibility and speed, in March 2009, the IMF created the Flexible Credit Line, the FCL, which is a fast-dispersing loan facility with low conditionality aimed at reassuring investors by injecting liquidity. Additionally, IMF loan programs require the imposition of austerity measures such as raising interest rates that can reduce foreign investment. In the case of the FCL, countries qualify for it not on the basis of their promises, but on the basis of their history. Just as individual borrowers with good credit histories are eligible for loans at lower interest rates than their risky counterparts, similarly, countries with sound macroeconomic fundamentals are eligible for drawings under the FCL. A similar program has been proposed for low-income countries. Known as the Rapid Credit Facility, it is front-loaded, allowing for a single upfront payment, as with the FCL, but is also intended to have low conditionality. Another opportunity for the IMF is cheerleading. The fund is positioning itself to be less of an adversary and more of a cheerleader to member countries. For some countries that need loans more for reassurance than reform, these changes to the fund toolkit are welcome, and this enables more domestic political and economic stability. Another opportunity is adaptability. Instead of providing the same medicine to all countries regardless of their particular problems, the new loan facilities are intended to aid reform-minded governments by providing short-term resources to reassure investors. In this manner, they help politicians in developing countries manage the downside costs of integration. In transparency, the IMF has made efforts to improve its own transparency and continues to encourage its member countries to do the same. Supporters note that this creates a barrier to any one or more countries that have more geopolitical influence in the organization. In reality, the major economies continue to exert influence on policy and implementation. To underscore the global expectations for the IMF's role, China, Russia, and other global economies have renewed calls for the G20 to replace the US dollar as the international reserve currency with a new global system controlled by the IMF. The Financial Times recently reported that the Chinese central bank's governor said the goal would be to create a reserve currency that is disconnected from individual nations and is able to remain stable in the long run, thus removing the inherent deficiencies caused by using credit-based national currencies. This is a clear sign that China, as the largest holder of US dollar financial assets, is concerned about the potential inflationary risk of the US Federal Reserve printing money. China has little choice but to hold the bulk of its $2 billion of foreign exchange reserves in US dollars, and this is unlikely to change in the near future. To replace the current system, expanding the role of special drawing rights, SDRs as talked about in your seminar question, were introduced by the IMF in 1969 to support the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate regime, but became less relevant once that collapsed in the 1970s. This new proposal would require extraordinary political vision and courage, and acknowledged a debt to John Maynard Keynes, who had made a similar suggestion in the 1940s. China is politically and economically motivated to recommend an alternative reserve currency. Politically, the country whose currency is the reserve currency is perceived as the dominant economic power. Economically, China has come under increasing global pressure to increase the value of its currency. So the key takeaways: the IMF is playing an expanding role in the global monetary system, and the IMF's key roles are the following: to promote international monetary cooperation, to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, to promote exchange stability, to assist in the establishment of multilateral system of payments, to give confidence to members by making the IMF's general resources temporarily available to them under adequate safeguards, and to shorten the duration and lessen the degree of disequilibrium in the international balances of payments of its members. And so we turn our attention then to the World Bank. The World Bank came into existence also in 1944, again at the Bretton Woods Conference, and its formal name is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IBRD, which clearly states its primary purpose of financing economic development. The World Bank's first loans were extended during the late 1940s to finance the reconstruction of the war-ravaged economies of Western Europe. When those nations recovered some measure of economic self-sufficiency, the World Bank turns its attention to assisting the world's poorer nations. The World Bank has one central purpose: to promote economic and social progress in developing countries by helping raise productivity so that their people may live a better and fuller life. In the last recorded year, the World Bank provided $46.9 billion for 303 projects in developing countries worldwide, with their financial and technical expertise aimed at helping those countries reduce poverty. The bank is currently involved in more than 1,800 projects in virtually every sector and every developing country. These projects are as diverse as providing microcredit in Bosnia and Herzegovina and raising AIDS prevention awareness in Guinea, supporting education of girls in Bangladesh, improving health care delivery in Mexico, and helping East Timor rebuild independence and India rebuild after a devastating earthquake. Today, the World Bank consists of two main bodies: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the International Development Association, established in 1960. The World Bank is part of the broader World Bank Group, which consists of 5 interrelated institutions: the IBRD, as I suggest, the IDA, the International Development Association, the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which was established in 1956, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, which was established in 1988, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, the ICSID, which was established in 1966. So these 5 groups then make up what is considered to be the World Bank. These additional members of the World Bank Group have specific purposes as well. The IDA typically provides interest-free loans to countries with sovereign guarantees. The IFC provides loans, equity, risk management tools, and structured finance. Its goal is to facilitate sustainable development by improving investments in the private sector. The Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, focuses on improving the foreign direct investment of developing countries. The ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, provides a means for dispute resolution between governments and private investors with the end goal of enhancing capital flow. The current primary focus of the World Bank centers on 6 strategic themes. First, the poorest countries. Poverty reduction and sustainable growth in the poorest countries, especially in Africa. Post-conflict and fragile states. Solutions to the special challenges of post-conflict countries and fragile states is adhered to. Another primary focus are middle-income countries. Development solutions with customized services as well as financing for middle-income countries. Looking at global public goods or addressing regional and global issues that cross national boundaries such as climate change, infectious disease, and trade. And finally, another primary focus is the Arab world, greater development and opportunity, and as always, knowledge and learning, leveraging the best global knowledge to support development. The World Bank provides low-interest loans, interest-free credits, and grants to developing countries. There's always a government or a sovereign guarantee of repayment subject to general conditions. The World Bank is directed to make loans for projects, but never to fund a trade deficit. These loans must have a reasonable likelihood of being repaid. The IDA was created to offer an alternative loan option. IDA loans are free of interest and offered for several decades, with a 10-year grace period before the country receiving the loan needs to begin repayment. These loans are often called soft loans. Since it issued its first bonds in 1947, the IBRD generates funds for its development work through the international capital markets. The World Bank issues bonds, typically about $25 billion a year. These bonds are rated AAA, which is the highest possible rating, because they are backed by member states' shared capital and by borrowers' sovereign guarantees. Because of the AAA credit rating, the World Bank is able to borrow at relatively low interest rates. This provides a cheaper funding source for developing countries, as most developing countries have considerably low credit ratings. The World Bank charges a fee of about 1% just to cover its administrative overheads. So what are the World Bank's current role and major challenges and opportunities? Well, like the IMF, the World Bank also has its critics and its supporters. The criticisms of the World Bank extend from the challenges that it faces in the global operating environment. Some of these challenges have complicated causes. Some result from the conflict between nations and the global financial crisis. But the following are, for example, of the world's difficult needs and the World Bank's efforts in trying to address them. Even in 2020, over 3 billion people live on less than $2.50 a day. At the start of the 21st century, almost 1 billion people can read or sign their names. Less than 1% of what the world spends each year on weapons would have put every child into school by the year 2018. Fragile states, such as Afghanistan and Rwanda and Sri Lanka, face severe development challenges, weak institutional capacity, poor governance, political instability, and often ongoing violence as a legacy of past conflict. The main criticisms of the World Bank include administrative incompetence, rewarding or supporting inefficient or corrupt countries, focusing on large projects rather than smaller local initiatives, a negative influence on theory and practice, and the dominance of the G7 countries in the operations of the World Bank. According to the Encyclopedia of the New American Nation and the New York Times, the World Bank is criticized primarily for the following reasons. Again, administrative incompetence. The World Bank and its lending practices are increasingly scrutinized, with critics asserting that the World Bank has shifted from being a lender of last resort to an international welfare organization, resulting in an institution that is bloated, incompetent, and even corrupt. Also incriminating is that the bank's lax lending standards have led to a rapidly deteriorating loan portfolio. Insofar as rewarding or supporting inefficient or corrupt countries, the bank's lending policies often reward macroeconomic inefficiency in the undeveloped world, allowing inefficient nations to avoid the types of fundamental reforms that would, in the long run, end poverty in their countries. Many analysts note that the best example is to compare the fantastic growth in East Asia to the deplorable economic conditions of Africa. In 1950, the regions were alike. South Korea had a lower per capita GDP than Nigeria. But by pursuing macroeconomic reforms, high savings, investing in education and basic social services, and opening their economies to global trading, the Pacific Tigers, as they're known, have been able to lift themselves out of poverty and into wealth with very little help from the World Bank. Many countries in Africa, however, have relied primarily on multilateral assistance from organizations like the World Bank while avoiding fundamental macroeconomic reforms with deplorable but sadly predictable results. Conservatives point out that the World Bank has lent more than $350 billion over half a century, mostly to the underdeveloped world, with little to show for it. One study argued that of the 66 countries that received funding from the bank from 1975 to 2000, well over half were no better off than before, and 20 were actually worse off. The study pointed out that Niger received $637 million between 1965 and 1995, yet its per capita GNP had fallen, in real terms, by more than 50% during that time. In the same period, Singapore, which received 1/7 as much World Bank aid, had seen its per capita GNP increase by more than 6% a year. In focusing on large projects rather than local initiatives, some critics claim that the World Bank loans give preference to large infrastructure projects like building dams and electric plants over projects that would benefit the poor, such as education and basic health care. The projects often destroy the local environment, including forests, rivers, and fisheries. Some estimates suggest that more than 2.5 million people have been displaced by projects made possible through World Bank loans. Failed projects, argue environmentalists and anti-globalization groups, were particularly illustrative. The Sardar Sarovar Dam on the Narmada River in India was expected to displace almost 250,000 people into squalid resettlement sites. The Palinauster Frontier Development Scheme has led to large-scale deforestation in the Brazilian rainforests. In Thailand, the Pak Mun Dam has destroyed the fisheries of the Moon River, impoverishing thousands who had made their living fishing and forever altering the diet of the region. Further, the large projects become targets for corruption by local government officials because there is so much money involved. Another example was in 2018 when the internal audit found that the IFC had ignored its own environmental and social protection standards when it approved nearly 200 million loan guarantees for palm oil production in Indonesia. Indonesia is home to the world's second largest reserve of natural forest and peat swamps, which naturally trap carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas that causes climate change. But rampant destruction of the forests to make way for palm oil plantations has caused releases of CO2 into the atmosphere, now making Indonesia the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. Looking at the negative influence on theory and practice, as one of the two Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank plays a large role in research, training, and policy formulation. Critics worry that because the World Bank and the IMF are regarded as experts in the field of financial regulation and economic development, their views and prescriptions may undermine or eliminate alternative perspectives on development. And finally, the dominance of the G7 countries. The industrialized countries dominate the World Bank and the IMF and its governance structures. Decisions are typically made and policies implemented by these leading countries, the G7, because they are the largest donors. some suggest without sufficient consultation with poor and developing countries. As with the IMF, there are opportunities for potential correctives in the World Bank. As vocal as the World Bank's critics are, so too are its supporters. The World Bank is praised by many for engaging in development projects in remote locations around the globe to improve living standards and reduce poverty. The World Bank's current focus is on helping countries achieve the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which are 8 international development goals established in 2000 at the Millennium Summit that all 192 United Nations member states and 23 international organizations have agreed to achieve. They include reducing extreme poverty, reducing child mortality rates, fighting disease epidemics, and developing a global partnership for development. The World Bank then is focused on the 4 key issues. First, increasing transparency. In response to the criticisms over the decades, the World Bank has made progress. More of the World Bank's decision-making and country assessments are available publicly. The World Bank has continued to work with countries to combat corruption, both at the country and at the bank levels. Looking at expanding social issues in the fight on poverty, in 2001, the World Bank began to incorporate gender issues into its policy. 2 years later, the World Bank announced that it was starting to evaluate all of its projects for their effects on women and girls, noting that poverty is experienced differently by men and women, and a full understanding of the gender dimensions of poverty can significantly change the definition of priority policy and program implementation. Examining improvements in the country's competitiveness and increasing exports, the World Bank's policies and its role as a donor have helped improve the ability of some countries to secure more of the global revenues for basic commodities. In Rwanda, for example, reforms transformed the country's coffee industry and increased exports. Kenya has expanded its exports of cut flowers, and Uganda has improved its fish processing industry. World Bank efforts have also helped African financial companies develop. Improving efficiency in diverse industries and leveraging the private sector, the World Bank has worked closely with businesses in the private sector to develop local infrastructure, including power, transportation, telecommunications, healthcare, and education. In Afghanistan, for example, small dams are built and maintained by the locals themselves in support of small industries processing local produce. The World Bank continues to play an integral role in developing countries reduce poverty and improve the well-being of their citizens. The World Bank's funding provides a resource to countries to utilize the services of global companies to accomplish their objectives. And so, just as we did with the IMF, we examine the key takeaways from this examination of the World Bank. The World Bank consists of 2 main bodies: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. The World Bank Group includes the following interrelated institutions: the IBRD, the IDA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. We reintroduce our choice of seminar questions. The first possible choice is to discuss whether SDRs, which you now understand, or another global currency created by the IMP, such as a cryptocurrency, should perhaps replace the US dollar as the international reserve currency. Or to describe the main criticisms of the IMF and the World Bank and describe what opportunities they may have in the future. Either of these seminar questions is acceptable. One is not better than the other. They both demonstrate in the student a grasp of the content recorded in today's lecture and ability to communicate that understanding extemporaneously in written form, which is one of the key student learning outcome takeaways for this class in our college catalog. Our seminar question is both the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and its successor, the World Trade Organization, WTO, seek to maintain open international trade between states. Using the 2019 Boeing Airbus decision as a case study, please describe the process by which the WTO granted the United States the authority to impose retaliatory tariffs on the European Union and what the EU's response has been. As an introduction to the WTO, we understand the classic era of free trade and international laissez-faire lasted less than 3 decades, from the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to approximately 1870s, when protectionist tariffs increased. From the latter decades of the 19th century to the years immediately following World War II, trade protection grew steadily until the 1930s. Post-World War II experienced trade liberalization and expansion, largely due to GATT, until the 1970s, with stagnation and a new protectionism. The use of non-tariff barriers to keep out all Japanese and other imports contributed to the stagnation. The shift from comparative to competitive advantage, fair labor standards, and an environmental protection also contributed to the new protectionism. What it is. The World Trade Organization is an intergovernmental organization, IGO, that is concerned with the regulation of international trade between nations. When it began, the WTO officially commenced on January 1st, 1995, under the Marrakesh Agreement, signed by 123 nations on April 15th, 1994, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which had commenced in 1948. The WTO is the largest international economic organization in the world. What it does. The WTO deals with regulation of trade in goods, services, and intellectual property between participating countries by providing a framework for negotiating trade agreements and a dispute resolution process aimed at enforcing participants' adherence to WTO agreements, which are signed by representatives of member governments and ratified by their parliaments. What they don't do. The WTO prohibits discrimination between trading partners but provides exceptions for environmental protections, national security, and other important goals. Trade-related disputes are resolved by independent judges at the WTO through formal dispute resolution process. Where they are. The WTO's current Director General is Roberto Azevedo, who leads a staff of over 600 people in Geneva, Switzerland. There are currently 164 member states with an annual budget of $200 million. In May 2013, Robert Azevedo was appointed to succeed Pascal Lamy as the WTO's Director General, with a term beginning September 1st, 2013. There were 9 nominated candidates for the role, Azevedo being considered the insider's candidate preferred by developing economies. His opponent, Mexican Herminio Blanco, was considered to have been the preferred candidate of the richer nations. The Brazilian government preempted the official announcement to state that Azevedo had won by a wide margin. The official announcement from the WTO's 3-person committee for selecting the Director General was published on May 8, 2013, declaring Azevedo as the emergent consensus candidate from several rounds of consultation. The formal election occurred at the General Council meeting on May 14th. Among the various functions of the World Trade Organization, These are regarded by analysts as the most important. It oversees the implementation, administration, and operation of the covered agreements, and it provides a forum for negotiations and for settling disputes. Additionally, it is the WTO's duty to review and propagate the national trade policies and to ensure the coherence and transparency of trade policies through surveillance in global economic policymaking. Another priority of the WTO is the assistance of developing, least developed, and low-income countries in transition to adjust to WTO rules and disciplines through technical cooperation and training. The WTO holds 5 binding principles: non-discrimination, reciprocity, binding and enforceable commitments, transparency, and safety. In non-discrimination, it has 2 major components: the most favored nation (MFN) rule and the national treatment policy. Both are embedded in the main WTO rules on goods, services, and intellectual property, but their precise scope and nature differ across these areas. The most favored nation (MFN) rule requires that a WTO member must apply the same conditions on all trade with other WTO members. In other words, a WTO member has to grant the most favorable conditions under which it allows trade in a certain product type to all other WTO members. In other words, if you grant someone a special favor, then you have to do the same for all the other WTO members. National treatment means that imported goods should be treated no less favorable than domestically produced goods, at least after the foreign goods have entered the market. And it was introduced to tackle non-tariff barriers to trade, such as technical standards, security standards, etc., discriminating against imported goods through non-tariff means. Another binding principle is reciprocity. It reflects both a desire to limit the scope of free riding that may arise because of the MFN rule and a desire to obtain better access to foreign markets. A related point is that for a nation to negotiate, it is necessary that the gain from doing so be greater than the gain available from unilateral liberalization. In other words, reciprocal concessions intended to ensure that such gains will materialize. Another principle is binding and enforceable commitments. The tariff commitments made by WTO members in a multilateral trade negotiation and on accession are enumerated in a schedule or a list of concessions. These schedules establish ceiling bindings. A country can change its bindings, but only after negotiating with its trading partners, which could mean compensating them for the loss of trade. If satisfaction is not obtained, the complaining country may invoke the WTO dispute settlement process. Another binding principle is transparency. The WTO members are required to publish their trade regulations, to maintain institutions allowing for the review of administrative decisions affecting trade, to respond to requests for information by other members, and to notify changes in trade policies to the WTO. These internal transparency requirements are supplemented and facilitated by periodic country-specific reports called trade policy reviews through the Trade Policy Review Mechanism. The WTO system tries also to improve predictability and stability, discouraging the use of quotas and other measures used to set limits on quantities of imports. The final guiding principle is safety. In specific circumstances, governments are able to restrict trade. The WTO's agreements permit members to take measures to protect not only the environment, but also public health, animal health, and plant health. We then look at the General Counsel subsidiary elements, which we will define here, but we'll touch on in greater detail further in this lecture. And this includes the Council for Trade in Goods, the Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, the Council for Trade and Services, and the Trade Negotiations Committee. The Council for Trade in Goods. There are 11 committees under the jurisdiction of the Goods Council, each with a specific task. All members of the WTO participate in the committees. The Textiles Monitoring Body is separate from the other committees, but still under the jurisdiction of the Goods Council. The body has its own chairman and only 10 members. The body also has several groups relating to textiles. Intellectual property rights. Information on intellectual property in the WTO, news and official records of the activities of the TRIPS Council, and details of the WTO's work with other international organizations in the field. The Council for Trade and Services operates under the guidance of the General Counsel and is responsible for overseeing the functioning of the General Agreement on Trade in Services, or the GATS agreement. It is open to all WTO members and can create subsidiary bodies as required. The Trade Negotiations Committee, the TNC, is the committee that deals with the current trade talks round. The chair of the TNC is the WTO's Director General. The WTO's predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established by a multilateral treaty of 23 countries in 1947 after World War II, in the wake of other new multilateral institutions dedicated to international economic cooperation, such as the World Bank, that was founded in 1944, and the International Monetary Fund, also founded in 1944 and 1945. We will have a separate lecture on those two organizations in future talks. A comparable international institution for trade, named the International Trade Organization, never started as the U.S. and other signatories didn't ratify the Establishment Treaty, and so GATT slowly became a de facto international organization. I'm fond of saying that the WTO had its birth at Bretton Woods, but Bretton Woods had its birth at Placentia Bay, at Newfoundland, in August of 1941, with the birth of the Atlantic Charter, Article 7, that created the Lend-Lease agreement between the United States and Great Britain, while the United States was still not part of World War II. In our reading, and in part in this lecture, we're going to be talking a lot about rounds, R-O-U-N-D. A round in the parlance of the WTO is a series of trade talks, as in a round being a sequence of recurring routine or repetitive actions or events, such as, I went about my round of chores, or attended the newest round of talks. For the WTO, rounds are named after the place of their occurrence, such as the Havana Round, the first one under GATT, or the Tokyo Round, or the Marrakesh Round, the last one under GATT that actually originated the WTO. There is also a ministerial conference that is held in Geneva every 2 years, and at that, the next round, if it's to be held, is decided. So we get back to our roots. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In July 1944, the United States and Great Britain held a conference at Bretton Woods for a set of post-war economic institutions, including setting up an international bank for reconstruction and development that's going to evolve into the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and then in December of 1945, the United Nations attempted to launch the idea of an international trade organization, as I mentioned before, the ITO. It met for a first set of negotiations in London. 23 founding members were presented and signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. In 1940, the ITO Charter was agreed to at a United Nations conference. And then in 1950, the U.S. announced that it would not seek U.S. congressional ratification of the Havana Charter, effectively terminating the ITO plan. And so GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, stood. So between 1946 and 1994, the GATT provided a framework for multilateral trade negotiations. Rounds reduced tariffs among member countries in many but not all sectors. The average tariff on manufactured products imposed by industrial countries fell from 35% to 4%. However, the GATT Secretariat could not always effectively enforce negotiated agreements without the legal standing of the ITO. And so they resolved with the Marrakesh Agreement providing for the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What does GATT entail? Well, really, again, the most important principle is non-discrimination. And there are important sub-principles under non-discrimination. First being the most favored nation. Each member must grant treatment to each other member as favorable as it extends to any other member country. For instance, if Japan lowers a tariff on Indonesia's exports of a certain product, it must also lower its tariff on the exports of that product from all other member countries. That being said, exceptions are allowed and preferences are granted. And that has to do with safety, and we'll talk about that guiding principle again. There is also an important principle of national treatment, and so it addresses the internal, domestic policies such as taxes. So foreign goods within a country should be treated no less favorably than domestic goods with regard to tax policies. A second important GATT principle is the general prohibition of quotas or quantitative restrictions on trade. This reflects a long-standing view that price distortions, tariffs, are preferred to quantity distortions in international markets. Quantitative restrictions were one of the most significant impediments to trade prior to the establishment of GATT. And again, however, exceptions are allowed. Some GATT exceptions include agricultural products, which are applied when certain domestic programs were in place, and they were granted to address U.S. agricultural programs and used for decades to reduce U.S. imports of sugar, dairy products, and peanuts. In addition, the United States insisted export subsidies be allowed for agriculture, which are generally prohibited by GATT. Now, the European Union became the most vociferous supporter of the exemptions in the 1980s and the 1990s, as they also sought exemptions. With agriculture being the first of the exemption, the second would be for textiles and clothing. In 1961, a U.S.-initiated conference of major textile traders was convened. It developed the short-term arrangement regarding international trade in cotton textiles, and so it withdrew cotton textile trade from the MFN system for a period of 1 year. Then, in October of 1962, the long-term arrangement regarding international trade in cotton textiles replaced the STA, or the short-term arrangement. It allowed importers to curb imports in cases of market disruption via bilateral or unilateral action. And so in 1972, a GATT fact-finding study on world textile trade was completed, resulting in the arrangement regarding international trade in textiles, or the multi-fiber arrangement. This allowed for general multilateral framework for managing textile and clothing trade. Unsurprisingly, there are strong reactions to these GATT exemptions. Exceptions generated negative feelings on the part of developing countries. Agriculture, textiles, and clothing are products countries first turn to in their trade and development process because developing countries rely on agriculture, textiles, and clothing as the basis for their domestic production. Developing countries then wondered how they could have a fair chance to participate in the trade and development process when the United States and the EU were given such exemptions in agriculture, textiles, and clothing. Tariffs are bound at an agreed-upon level, often above applied levels. In other words, levels may not be increased in the future, applied rates below bound rates must be increased, and there is a general purpose of the binding principle, which is to introduce a degree of predictability into the world trading system. GATT introduced stipulations with regard to subsidies, countervailing duties, and anti-dumping duties. The use of subsidies is not supposed to harm trading interests of other members. If subsidies cause material injury or a threat thereof to the domestic industry of another country, that country can apply countervailing duties or tariffs on its imports of product from the subsidizing country. Now, this leaves room for different interpretations and results in a controversy, especially about dumped goods or dumping. Dumped goods are defined as exports sold at a price below those charged by the exporter in its domestic market. It's allowed for anti-dumping duties and tariffs to be imposed under certain circumstances. So again, the WTO, the initial Bretton Woods vision of an international trade organization, ended in 1950. In 1990, Canada proposed a multilateral trade organization, the MTO, to address weaknesses in the GATT Secretariat. In 1991, the Director General of GATT, Arthur Dunkel, released a draft agreement for the Uruguay round that became known as the Dunkett Text, and this included a draft charter of the MTO, or Multilateral Trade Organization. By the end of 1993, the text of the Uruguay round contained a final charter for the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And so the Marrakesh Agreement is actually Marrakesh Agreement establishing the World Trade Organization. The Marrakesh Agreement and the WTO is sometimes referred to as a tripod in that it primarily addressed the following three areas: the trade in goods, an agreement on agriculture and an agreement on textiles and clothing; trade in services, as specified in the General Agreement on Trade and Services; and intellectual property, as specified in the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. And these included a WTO charter. And so it established the WTO as a legal international organization, and it stipulated that the WTO shall provide the common institutional framework for the conduct of trade relations among its members, and define the functions of the WTO. And so if you look at the administrative structure of the WTO in this chart called Table 7.2, Administrative Structure, you have the body, the composition of the body, and the function of the body. So the first of these four is the Ministerial Conference, with representatives of all members of the WTO, and it meets at least once every 2 years, carries out the functions of the WTO, and makes decisions and takes action. Then you also have the General Council, which is also composed of representatives of all members, and it meets between the meetings of the Ministerial Conference. It establishes rules and procedures, discharges responsibilities of the Dispute Settlement Body, and discharges responsibilities of the Trade Policy Review Body. Next, we have the Secretariat, who is the Director General and his staff, and they conduct the organizational business of the WTO. Then we have the Council for Trade in Goods, which oversees the functioning of the multilateral agreements in what's known as the WTO Annex 1A. Further, you have the Council for Trade and Services that oversees the functioning of the multilateral agreements of Annex 1B. You have the Council for Trade-Related Aspect of Intellectual Property Rights that oversees the functioning of the multilateral agreements in Annex 1C. You have the Dispute Settlement Body that establishes panels adopts panel and appellate body reports, maintains surveillance of implementation of rulings and recommendations. You have panels, 3 or 5 well-qualified government and or non-government individuals make up this body that assists in dispute settlement by making findings and recommendations in dispute settlement cases. You also have the appellate body, the last of these bodies, made up of 7 persons, 3 of whom serve on any one case, and hears appeals from panel cases. Now, as we get to the pros and cons and the criticisms of the WTO, going back to the General Council, where they meet between the meetings of the Ministerial Conference to establish rules and policies, in a pragmatic, real world, the poorer countries, the developing countries, often can't maintain their legation, their representatives, between the big 2 ministerial conferences. It takes a lot of money to maintain a legate and their staff. And so oftentimes the poorer countries, the developing countries, are underrepresented at the General Council, where a lot of the rules and procedures are made. And so this benefits the larger, wealthier, industrialized nations and disbenefits the poorer developing countries. We remember trade in goods, which is an agreement on agriculture, which addresses 3 outstanding issues concerning the international trade in agricultural goods specifically. First is market access, and it replaced a quota-based system under GATT with a system of bound tariffs and tariff reduction commitments. It's known as tariffication and represents a significant change of regime. There are also non-tariff measures, quotas, which are now prohibited. It also includes domestic support. Again, the distinction is made between domestic policy and international policy. There are green box measures, which are exempt from any reduction commitments, and amber box measures, which are not exempt. We'll come back and talk about green box and amber box exemptions. It also addresses export subsidies. Use has not been eliminated of export subsidies, but is limited to specific situations. We remember that the agreement on agriculture, it's best viewed as a change in rules, not as a significant program for the liberalization of trade in agricultural products. There is the hope that further liberalization of tariffed quotas will take place in the current Doha round of trade negotiations. And with the agreement on textiles and clothing, it requires countries to reintegrate textile and clothing sectors back into the GATT framework. At the end of a 10-year period, all quotas on textile and clothing trade must be removed, and these are stated in the terms of product categories listed in the ATC Annex that we discussed earlier. But there are some noteworthy points. Integration is in terms of volume and not in value. Importing countries expanded the Annex to include many items that were really never subject to the MFA. And there is a safeguard clause which can be invoked to slow down its implementation. With trade and services, this composes more than 20% of the total world trade and has at times grown faster than trade in goods. With the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, the significant outcome of the Uruguay round represented first-time services were brought into multilateral trade agreement, and negotiations were difficult due to the fact that trade in services is less tangible than trade in goods. And so it defined trade in services as occurring in one of 4 modes. First mode is cross-border trade. Second mode is movement of consumers. The third mode is foreign direct investment, or FDI, that we've touched on several times in this class. And the fourth mode is the movement of natural persons. And so with cross-border trade, it's mode of supply that does not require actual physical movement of producers or consumers. For example, Indian firms move medical transcription services to U.S. hospitals via satellite technology. Next, you have movement of consumers, and so consumer travel to the country of the producer, an example for tourism services, is under this rubric. Foreign direct investment, FDI, services that require a commercial presence by producers in the country of the consumers, for example, any financial services. And finally, temporary movement of natural persons, or the non-commercial presence by production, for example, consulting, construction, and instructional services, such as the Belt and Road Initiative from China in Africa. There is, of course, difficulty negotiating GATS. There is a resistance from a number of developing countries. The United States and the European Union supported it and prevailed upon developing countries to allow negotiations to move forward. Each member was allowed to specify non-discrimination exemptions on a negative list of sectors upon entry into the agreement, and those were to last for 10 years. In the general agreement on trades and services, there is also positive list restrictions, including service suppliers, the total value of service transactions, the total number of operations and output, the number of personnel employed, the type of legal entity in the case of an FDI, and these requirements were optional if a member identified ones they wanted to maintain in a second positive list. Protocols to GATS include a revised schedule of commitments on financial services dated 1995, schedules of specific commitments relating to the movement of natural persons in 1995, the schedules of specific commitments concerning basic telecommunications agreed to in 1997, and finally the fifth GATS protocol, schedules of specific commitments and its list of exemptions from Article 2 concerning financial services that was agreed to in 1998. With intellectual property product and process patents, this is an important conversation happening in today's trade negotiations and is a big bone of contention between the United States and China. Intellectual property product and process patents address an asset in the form of rights conferred upon a product of invention or creation by a country's legal system. And so there is an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS. Now, remembering that China came into the WTO in 2000 then, and notwithstanding the exemptions and the restrictions, both positive and negative, that last 10 years, China is held to these conventions as well. Again, it was the most contentious aspect of the Marrakesh Agreement, and it defined intellectual property as belonging to one of 6 categories: copyrights, trademarks, geographical indications, industrial designs, patents, layout designs of integrated circuits, and applied the principle of non-discrimination then to intellectual property. So going into it a little more fully then, the TRIPS agreement sets out the obligations for its members. Again, for copyrights, members must comply with the 1971 Berne Convention on Copyrights that established an international agreement on how to acknowledge, address, and respect copyrights. And so the members must comply with that separate agreement. With trademarks, goods and services are to be protected for a term of no less than 7 years. Provisions for the registration of trademarks must be made and are renewable indefinitely. With geographical indications, members must provide legal means to prevent false use of geographical indications. With industrial design, members must protect independently created industrial designs that are new or original. With patents, exemptions exist and include the protection of the public order, human, animal, and plant life in a domestic market, and layout designs of integrated circuits include the distribution of protected layout designs being forbidden. With the TRIPS agreement, we understand that citizens and firms in developed countries own most of the world's intellectual property. Developing countries often have less IP protection than developed countries, especially in the case of patents. And so this raises the cost of many goods and services to developing countries, because it represents a transfer from the developing country consumers to the developed country producers. It allows for greater transition periods for developing countries under those 6 obligations. And so developed countries must have instituted the above obligations by 1996. Developing countries must have instituted them by 2000. And least developed countries have until 2005 to agree to those 6 obligations as a transition period. So again, with the TRIPS agreement, in short to medium time frames, welfare gains may be absent. Some economists from developing countries consider TRIPS to be a welfare worsening, non-trade agenda item that has no place in the WTO. They argue that it lacks efficiency gains that characterize trade and restricts freedom of countries to choose intellectual property regime that is best for them. It represents a significant concession on the part of the developing world, and again, one of the most contentious area of agreement is under AIDS drugs. So the U.S. government has pressured country to honor the U.S. patents on AIDS drugs, which could effectively price drugs above the reach of AIDS patients in certain countries, thereby increasing AIDS mortality rates. And so, at a meeting in 2001, offered flexibility with regard to public health. And so, the benefits to developing countries from TRIPS, well, according to economist Keith Mascus in 2000, he argues that there is increased inward FDI and technology transfer as a benefit of joining TRIPS, and increased domestic innovation. He argues that TRIPS imposes short-term costs in the hope of generating long-term benefits. Your seminar question centers on the dispute between Boeing and Airbus in the United States and the EU, and so it's important that we understand the dispute settlement process in the WTO. We begin, as I suggest, with consultation. And if it's not resolved in 60 days, it heads to a panel. If the decisions are appealed, it goes to the appellate body. And if the member is found to be inconsistent with the agreement by virtue of the appellate body, the disputed measure is brought into conformity. So again, if the consultation process fails to settle a dispute within 60 days, the complaining member may request the establishment of a panel. Remember, a panel is composed of 3 or 5 well-qualified governmental or non-governmental individuals. Its function is to assist the dispute settlement process, and it consults the parties involved and provides the dispute settlement process with a written report of its findings. The Dispute Settlement Board has 60 days to adopt the report by consensus, unless a party to the dispute decides to appeal. So the appeal of a panel report is referred to an appellate body. It reviews the appeal and submits its report to the Dispute Settlement Board, and any Dispute Settlement Board member can effectively insist on the adoption of the appellate body report. So the dispute settlement procedure applies to all aspects of the Marrakesh Agreement, or the WTO. It improves the procedures of the old GATT and makes a significant contribution to the conduct of international trade. The effectiveness of the procedures depends on the member's commitment to it. A country has the option of ignoring the outcome of a dispute settlement process. So the complaining member has a right to impose retaliatory tariffs on a volume of imports from the other country determined by the DSB. And this is exactly what happened in the Airbus-Boeing conflict. Now, when we're looking at the environment and GATT, or the WTO, in 1991, the GATT reactivated a working group on environmental measures and international trade called EMIT. GATT Dispute Resolution Panel issued its controversial opinion in the now famous tuna dolphin case. It ruled against U.S. law barring imports of Mexican tuna that involved dolphin unsafe fishing practices. It was argued that the import ban violated the general prohibition against quotas, and the United States had not attempted to negotiate cooperative agreements on a dolphin-safe tuna fishing program. The U.S. environmental community reacted strongly against the GATT panel ruling, casting the GATT as anti-environmentalists. The trade environment issue has loomed large over the WTO ever since. The Environmental Measures and Intellectual Trade, EMIT, was replaced by the Committee on Trade and the Environment. Most developing country members of WTO have taken a dim view of the work of the CTE, the Committee on Trade and the Environment. They fear the possibility of further protection against their exports on environmental grounds, what they term green protection. They often view environmental matters as non-trade issues that have no place in the trade policy agenda of the WTO. Many trade economists support the developing country view that the environmental issues represent an intrusion into WTO trade agenda. They suggest the environmental agenda could result in an inappropriate one-size-fits-all approach to environmental policies across WTO members. In 1999, WTO formally took up trade and environmental issue. Its report argued that increased trade can have both positive and negative impacts on the environment. It emphasizes trade-driven growth cannot always be counted upon to deliver improvements in environmental quality through increased incomes. Consequently, these higher incomes must be translated into higher environmental quality through the mechanism of international cooperation. It also emphasized that governmental subsidies to polluting and resource-depleting sectors such as agriculture, fishing, and energy can actually exacerbate the environmental consequences of trade. To recap, the WTO is a body designed to promote free trade through organizing trade negotiations and acts as an independent arbiter in settling trade disputes. To some extent, the WTO has been successful in promoting greater free trade. The principles of the WTO are non-discrimination, reciprocity, binding and enforceable commitments, transparency, and sanctions, some restrictions on trade. So it promotes free trade through the gradual reduction of tariffs. It provides a legal framework for the negotiation of trade disputes. This aims to provide greater stability and predictability in trade. In seeking trade without discrimination, it avoids preferential trade agreements. The WTO is not a completely free trade body. It allows tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions, for example, protection against dumping, as suggested before, of cheap surplus goods. The WTO is committed to protecting fair competition. There are rules on subsidies and dumping. The WTO is committed to economic development. For example, recent rounds have put pressure to accelerate restrictions on imports from the least developing countries. So, there are several advantages of promoting free trade, obviously. There are lower prices for consumers because it removes tariffs, enabling cheaper imports so that you and I spend less for the goods that we're buying. It could be argued that free trade encourages greater competitiveness. Classic liberalism, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, through free trade, firms face a higher incentive to cut costs. For example, a domestic monopoly may now face competition from foreign firms. There is the law of comparative advantage, and this is also Adam Smith's ideal. Specifically, he was talking about wool in England and wine in Portugal. And this states that free trade will enable an increase in economic welfare. This is because countries can specialize in producing goods that they have a lower opportunity cost of creating. In other words, if they can create wine much more cheaply than England, then they can sell that wine, make money, and buy England's wool, which it can produce much less cheaply than Portugal. There are also economies of scale. By encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce a higher quantity. This enables more economies of scale. This is important for industries with high fixed costs, such as car and airplane manufacture. In new trade theory, It is this specialization and the exploitation of economies of scale that is most important factor in improving economic welfare. In the success of the WTO, they have had some modicum of success. And so to what extent has the WTO been able to promote free trade? Well, the WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. Over 20 countries are seeking to join the WTO. As I suggested, China had to remove over 7,000 trade barriers in order to be allowed to join. An increased number of trade disputes have been brought to the WTO, and showing the WTO really is a forum for helping resolve those disputes. WTO regulations and cooperations helped avoid a major trade war. This was significant especially during the 2008-2009 global recession, which isn't to say there aren't disadvantages to the WTO. It has been criticized for trade rules which are still unfavorable towards developing countries. Many developed countries went through a period of tariff protection. This enabled them to protect new emerging domestic industries. Free trade may prevent developing countries from developing their infant industry. For example, if a developing country was trying to diversify their economy to develop new manufacturing industry, they may be unable to do so without some form of tariff protection, which is inherent mercantilism. The WTO is being overshadowed by the new TIP trade deals. These deals are negotiated away from the WTO and focuses mainly on the US and the EU. It excludes China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and it threatens to diminish the importance of the WTO. Further, there is the difficulty of making progress. WTO trade deals have been quite difficult to form consensus. Various rounds have taken many years to slowly progress. It results in countries seeking alternatives such as TIP or local bilateral deals. WTO trade deals still encompass a lot of protectionism in areas like agriculture, cloth and textiles, protectionist tariffs which primarily benefit richer nations such as the EU and the US. WTO has implemented a strong defense of TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights. These allow firms to implement patents and copyrights. Again, in areas such as life-saving drugs, it has raised the price and made it less affordable for developing countries. The WTO has rules which favor multinationals. For example, the most favored nation principle means countries should trade without discrimination. This has advantages but also disadvantages because it means that developing countries cannot give preference to local contractors, but may have to choose foreign multinationals, whatever their history in repatriation of profit or investment in the area. So again, going back to our seminar question, both GATT and its successor, the WTO, seek to maintain open international trade between states. Using the 2019 Boeing-Airbus decision as a case study, please describe the process by which the WTO granted the U.S. authority to impose retaliatory tariffs on the EU and what the EU's response has been. So this is going to take a little research and a little reading online for you. But now that you have the basis of GATT and the WTO, what it's intended to do, and what its dispute settlement process is, you can look at this case study of Boeing and Airbus in 2019 and this fight between the EU and the US and describe what happened a little more fully with a little more understanding of the WTO and its process. That is our lecture for the WTO. Thank you.